Today we're continuing our discussion in the book of Psalms. We have a little longer one, so if you have your copy of Scripture, I'm going to read Psalm 33, beginning in verse 1 in the New English Translation. You godly ones, shout for joy because of the Lord. It is appropriate for the morally upright to offer him praise. Give thanks to the Lord with the harp. Sing to him to the accompaniment of a 10-stringed instrument. Sing him a new song. Play skillfully as you shout out your praises to him. For the Lord's decrees are just, and everything he does is fair. He promotes equity and justice. The Lord's faithfulness extends throughout the earth. By the Lord's decrees, the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all the starry hosts. He piles up the water of the seas. He puts the oceans in storehouses. Let the whole earth fear the Lord. Let all who live in the world stand in awe of him, for he spoke and it came into existence. He issued the decree and it stood firm. The Lord frustrates the decisions of the nations. He nullifies the plans of the peoples. The Lord's decisions stand forever. His plans abide throughout the ages. How blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen to be his special possession. The Lord watches from heaven. He sees all people. From the place where he lives, he looks carefully at all the earth's inhabitants. He is the one who forms every human heart and takes note of all their actions. No king is delivered by his vast army. A warrior is not saved by his great might. A horse disappoints those who trust in it for victory. Despite its great strength, it cannot deliver. Look, the Lord takes notice of his loyal followers, those who wait for him to demonstrate his faithfulness by saving their lives from death and sustaining them during times of famine. We wait for the Lord. He is our deliverer and shield. For our hearts rejoice in him, for we trust in his holy name. May we experience your faithfulness, O Lord, for we wait on you. I haven't been doing this much lately, but I kind of was looking to find a title for this psalm. And I think what I have decided in thinking about it, that this psalm is really what we would call a key to a thankful heart. And we know that from scriptures talking about being thankful is critically important. In fact, 1 Thess 5:18 says, in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Which is interesting. His will, it is in all the vast planning that he has, that Paul has pointed out that in everything we give thanks, and that is God's plan. Is it his only plan? Well, probably not, but a critical one, a key one. And if we really think about it, when we look at the idea of concept of thankfulness, I think it's important to understand that thankfulness is really kind of bound up in the basis of trust. That, when we think about trust tied together with this thankfulness, I think if we admit it, we by nature are not trusting creatures. We just don't trust too many people. I think if we really put it down to brass tacks, we often trust God when we're forced to trust him, when there's no one else, nothing else we can do. And I think about one thing Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. So, and I think looking at it, often we attempt to work out our difficulties on our own before we finally turn to God. So as a kind of an introduction to this psalm, I think we could admit it's a really powerful hymn of praise and emphasize his sovereignty, his creativity, and his faithfulness. We've seen parts of this in many places. Now, we don't know, they didn't name this author, but I think if we look at our previous and the next 32 and 34, both of those were written by David. So it's probable that this was also David. And I think we could kind of start looking at it. Again, it's a larger song than we normally would try to tackle. But I think David, if he is the author, said that God is worthy of our thanks and his praise, but he does something a little different. He says we should do this by singing. Now, We have some in here that I would feel comfortable listening to them sing. And then some of us would say, well, I might be able to carry a tune, but I can't deliver it. So that may be what we might think about. But David was wanting to point out how important it was to sing. And we have a good part of our worship services every Sunday in praise and singing and worship, if you will. And David frames his beginning the first 5 verses of this psalm that it's really a call to worship by this singing that he does. And he wants the righteous to sing, both sing and rejoice in the Lord. And for us, he reflects on the idea that worship is really not only appropriate, but it's really a natural response to God's recognizing God's goodness, faithfulness, and justice. And we do know that as David is focusing, and he knows that the creation rejoices in God. It also yearns for that day of redemption. But he also knows that it coming from the righteous and justices of God, that in fact is a way of rejoicing and resulting from this singing. And I think it shows that the love of the righteous and justice of God, justices of God, are really, you would call central qualities of God's character. And you would think that, David is trying to say that if we recognize that these qualities are central to God's character, then we should hold them in great value as his children. That if they're central to who God is, then we should in fact elevate that part in our own lives as we try to focus on the things that we do. And David says something I think is really cool. Verses 1 and 9 in this section talks about God creating by his spoken word. And we saw that in Psalm 8. For anyone who's ever read the Gospel of John, the first 3 verses talk about what God has done. Hebrews 11:3 is a real critical part, talking about how by his word the world was created, came into being. And so, but David wants to emphasize that. And when you think about it, you're looking at the Genesis account, God spoke and there was light, and God spoke and there was this division of the land, and God spoke and the stars and the skies, and he spoke and these kind of dry ground appeared. All these things happen all by his word. And if we ever get, Lord willing, get through Psalm, we'd maybe go to Gospel of John, he uses the idea of word, which is a very interesting concept in reflecting who God is. So because of his sovereignty, his power has come about in his spoken word, it also has a tendency to endure, to prevail, to last, to resist evil. And so he says this in verses 10 and 12, how this prevailing of his will really is focused in that God's plans stand forever, and that no human endeavors, no human schemes, no human's evil plans can thwart God's purposes. And in Peter, in Acts 4, and maybe I've got this wrong exactly who spoke it, maybe this was part of his sermon, he relates to the events of his days, and he says, "For indeed both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people together, people of Israel, assembled together in this city against your holy servant Jesus." They were trying to defeat this whole plans. Jesus, whom you, meaning God, anointed, and this is how the application says, to do as much as your power, God's power, and your plan, God's plan, had decided beforehand what happened. So all these bad things were all according to God's plan. Well, we do that, but the speaker here, and I hope it's Peter, clarify that and let people, I think it is Peter, that is what the whole purpose of God was. And the next thing that the psalmist is sharing for us is that it shows God's providence, and that's an interesting word. Unfortunately for those deists in the beginning of our nation, they were almost all believing, they call God God's providence. They didn't use his will. There's kind of a happenstance, if you will, that God kind of directed. But I think we can understand that carefully. So David, if he's the one in 13 through 19, says, God sees all of mankind and he cares for them. He's not willing that any should perish. And that it's not just an intellectual knowledge, I would consider it intimately aware. He knows the details. He lets things happen, unfortunately for us in many cases, the good and bad, the bad primarily that he lets happen, that they are actively part of events that happen in our lives and the affairs of our lives, and that it's all bound up in the affairs of the nations and of individuals. Yet the thing he points out, and David, we've seen this before, is that God does not work through man's strength or his plans, his schemes. He more often than not works apart from those, in contrast to those, in opposition to those things. That it's a substitution. Man tries to, as David said here, horses fail. They don't do anything. We try to, not by might, but by your will. We see that all over Scripture. And but as a contrast, David says here, but God does work through those who fear and trust him. And it's going to present a little conundrum we're going to try to approach at the end of our little time together. That even though this military might and human strength cannot save, we know that only God, through his care and his protection, really provide this essential security, the things that we need. And, and for those who have, I would say, abilities, if I were a military genius, or I was a physically strong person, or whatever, intellectual powerhouse, I might tend to think that these aspects of my life are how I'm going to solve my problem. But when you really think about it, that's not true. Because I guarantee you, Satan knows what your strengths are, but he also knows what your weaknesses are. And that he will attack you in those areas that you're weak. So even though you might say, well, I got this, if this happens to me, I've got it, I can control it. But all of a sudden, boom, where'd this come from? What do? I can't use what I normally relied upon, my mental, physical, military abilities to solve this problem. And in many ways, that's really a plus, because if I'm thinking properly and realize that I can't do it, what's left? I have to rely on the Lord. He has to be the one who would provide those responses, the ability to overcome. And so recognizing that, I think in the last part of this psalm, David is saying, and I think we could acknowledge that our final result is that we must, and we should, and definitely have to, trust and hope in him. So, and he winds this up. He says a couple things. He says he issues a call, if you will, that he's trying to encourage his readers, those who are hearing, that we need to wait and hope in the Lord, recognizing that he is both our help and our shield, protection and ability, provisions. And so it's important for David to have what I would call patient trust in God's timing, and that it all comes from his really unfailing love, and that because of God's steadfast love, and that's an interesting word if you ever see it in the original. I'm trying to think what the Authorized Version calls it, but it's a covenant loyalty. It may not be hope. I'll have to think about it. I apologize for not remembering. But it's because of God's covenants, because of God's promises, that we can trust totally upon his providing an answer. It may not be the answer we want, but it's the answer that will in fact further his kingdom. And so recognize that because of God's steadfast love in us and our steadfast love for him, and that we hope in him, that we can maintain and hope to maintain, are encouraging us to help to maintain this hope and confidence that God's love never fails. And I think that's, in this large psalm, that's what we could probably grab and put our hands upon. That, in fact, we recognize that. So I think the psalm really encourages us to worship and trust God because He is sovereign, that He has ultimate power, He has creative authority, He has justice, and that He has loving care for each of us. And that so, regardless of the situation, because regardless of the things that happens, we don't see it, we don't understand it, but God's plans will prevail, and we should be confident in that He will accomplish His purposes, and that within all of that, we know that God's love for us is dependable. And that's an interesting word. It's a good word, dependable. I'm on the side of the road, and my battery on my car died, which, by the way, happened a couple days ago. I'd hit the emergency flashers, went into work. 4 hours later, it was all dead. But I was confident that my stepson would come over and help me get my car started. But it's more than that. God's plans will prevail, and He is dependable. So we have to recognize that even in the bad things that are happening now, and have happened before and probably will happen, that God's control over the world and the personal lives will go through to the end so that we can be confident in His eternal purposes. We might miss the short-term things. Why did this happen? When we all can see things where, family. I had a good friend of mine. He was a pastor in Syracuse, and as his wife was driving his 3 kids to school in Warsaw, they were killed in a head-on collision south of Syracuse. And he was devastated, but he was confident that God would accomplish His purpose even in that horrible thing. Good friend of mine. And that happened a number of years ago. But he knew that God's eternal purposes would, in fact, prevail. And in this, looking at this psalm, I was faced with a number of questions, and maybe you might think about some of those. If we look at the way the world thinks now, especially in our country, we can't relate how other countries exist. At the way modern, I use the term modern, evolutionary thinking, if you will. Why is it, if we've got the right understanding in their minds, why do they reject biblical Christianity? What is it about God's plan as we understand it in the church not acceptable to modern thinkers? Have you ever thought about it?
That's easy, because they want to be in control, and with God, they're not in control. If you believe in God, you believe that God is in control of your life, and the people that don't believe in God think that they're in control of their life.
So I'm not the captain of my own fate?
I think it's stronger even today is the more technology that we have and the things that we can do, even medically or whatever. We think we don't need God, we can do it ourselves. And that's kind of a very basic thing that kids even do. I can do it myself. I don't need mom and dad to zip my code even, or something little like that.
Yeah, that's a little different contrast to what Kevin is saying. You're giving me why they think that they do. But I think the point is why do they not want to think like we do? And I think Kevin's hit it, that we like being in control. We think we've got all the technology, the plan, the brains. There's another solution around the corner. What's the latest one? AI. Or we're going to get the answers to that. And they keep finding these medical solutions to problems, and I'm thankful for it. But there's always some other things. But for some reason, that ability is keeping them from realizing the helplessness that they need, that I am not in control, that I can't resolve the issues around me.
Don't you think God lets us find the medical answers? Don't you think that's something that He is in control of? I mean,
oh yeah. But when it becomes a crutch, You know, is anybody else up there?
One way to bring people back around to the reality of that is just to tell them or show them that death is still 100%.
Yeah.
It's going to get everybody. So,
Final.
yeah, that's
And they will meet their maker
Yep.
when they die.
so.
Maybe.
And well, for those who
Oh, they will, one way or the other.
and I've talked about I feel for children in school. I read a book a long time called they're already gone. The things that children are getting in school, especially even children of believers, you know, they have to wrestle with this. I hate to use the term contrast. Dichotomy is a technical term. That the church teaches that God created everything, and now they're getting all this science, and a lot of them have fallen to a middle position. And I'm going to say, you know, many say you can believe in God, but He only helped in the creation. That He only kind of guided it, and used science, used mental ability. And by doing that, they somehow say, well, the Bible mostly true, but it's not scientific. And it's a real challenge. So be thinking about that. You know, how do people say they can do that? With another question that one of my sources says, if we affirm that God is sovereign over all things, we saw that in 10:12 of this verse, can it help us to be thankful? And be not only thankful, but be thankful worshiping people. That because God is in control, we can be thankful and worship God. You know, but recognizing that, does that help? And here's the one that I'm going to go with what Gary was saying. Where is the balance between using human methods versus trusting in God alone? Is there a balance? Then,
Not if He's sovereign, right?
but you still, yeah, but you know, is there a balance? Because does God use human methods?
We're His tools. We're His.
I think back to, was it Freeman who was in this area years ago? And you just had to believe to be healed. No medicine, no
Hobart
doctors.
Freeman?
Yes, that's taking it too far.
Yeah.
Yes, we should trust in God, but if He gives us those abilities, those methods of helping to heal, helping to get better, then
And He gives us a brain.
yeah.
That's the way He is. That's the way He is healing you. You trust in Him, and He gave somebody the tools to figure out how to heal you. I mean, that's God's work. That's God's work right there, right?
But He still can heal without those if He wants.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, sure.
He can use different methods.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I may have shared this. I used to go to a church just east of your sister church. They were wanting to build on like this was added on to the church. And we were praying for a miracle because it was expensive. And one of the members had got a source that would finance it all. Low interest, pay for it all. You could have it now, you don't have to wait. And we were saying, boy, the Lord answered. One of our brothers says, we need God to provide it, to give it to us. He thought, well, we've got to have the faith that God's going to provide it. And that wasn't, in his mind, that wasn't God answering prayer. He wanted it all. That someone would call up the church and says, I'm going to give you the money. That's just and that was a big battle. Was my faith weak because I thought this provision of a financing was an answer to prayer, not accepting a gift? Could it have been? I don't know. But it caused controversy. But so there is a balance somewhere in using human methods. And this, you guys said, versus trust us in God. I don't like verses because sometimes I think they're tied together. That God uses all things to accomplish His purposes. I mean,
So does our faith in God, do you think that clouds our judgment sometimes? I mean, like the low interest thing.
Yeah.
That was the answer to your prayers, but it was, and the answer was yes. But that wasn't the answer to his prayers.
Yeah.
So the answer was no to his prayer. So,
Let me give you a biblical example.
okay, so was his faith more?
Jesus and his disciples are on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. I've got 5,000 men, maybe twice that many women and children. They're starving. Why didn't God just open heaven and drop all the food?
Could have dropped manna like he did.
He could have, or quail. But what did he do?
That's what they had.
He used what a little boy had provided. That little boy didn't know he was bringing the source of all this. So his...
There you go.
So God used human methods to accomplish his will.
Well, sometimes I think we need to step out of faith, but I mean, we gotta do our part.
Yeah.
You know, there's been times, you know, back when, many years ago, when I need some money, I'm gonna we're out, and God will provide overtime at the job.
There you go.
And that's not something that I wanted to do. I don't want that overtime.
Yeah.
But money's not gonna just fall out of the sky. You know, it can.
Yeah.
But chances are, no. You got to do your part
Yeah.
if you want to.
Look how long
James.
those disciples were
Exactly.
rowing that boat before Jesus caught up with them.
See, there's another example. You asked for help, and he provided. But what about the next guy that asked for help and expects, the money to fall from the sky? I mean,
And we've heard of stories where individuals, a widow with children starving, and all of a sudden they go out on their front porches a bunch of bread, groceries,
well,
or someone
He
sent.
provides in many ways.
yeah. Well, the fellow that made Mark, the guy that did the painting out here, he said that his family was starving and needed money, and he prayed to God, and he went out, and there was a check in his mailbox.
Yeah. So, but see, that was the level of miracle, if you want to use that, he needed, that God felt he needed.
So does
The level that you and I might need is more time at work, or even a job.
So is that the Holy Spirit working in you when you say this is the answer?
I think you could not doubt it. There's some level in there that we have to grab hold of. That, God knows what I need. For Mark, it was this check in the mail. For perhaps me, is a new job or a raise or overtime.
So is that what the Holy Spirit is working in you, that you understand that's that's the answer that you're
If
wanting?
you acknowledge in your mind that whatever happened to provide your relief for your situation, and give due honor to God for providing it. God, you gave me this.
Yeah.
And I don't know,
It's
maybe
not-
Mark
not
would have been
me
happy with
doing
it.
things. It's
Yeah.
all me, but it was
Maybe Mark could have
Let
been
God
just
do it
as
all.
thrilled to have a job, or someone providing food, but money, God likes. I think he's got a sense of humor sometimes, and we've all had answers to prayer. It more often than not, it's not what we expect, but he does include in many times, as we give the, man and human methods. And I think if we really think about it, now that the Lord is left physically, could we not say that every miracle has been provided by a human method? I think about that. He brought some into my life that had this answer. He gave opportunity through some. We have to wrestle with that because, God could have done, and we talked to this before, that, God could have done it all by himself. He didn't need to send the disciples out. He could have just, angels spoke from heaven, ooh, but he used them. Weak as they were, as frail, including Judas, to do these things. I think in this part of God's program, human methods if and properly framed in honoring God and recognizing that it's God that provided that, I think that's the way God does it.
And you mentioned Judas, on the contrary, at the same time almost, there was Peter, that Jesus said, "You're gonna deny me 3 times."
Oh, I'll never do
Well,
that.
he did. Judas, threw him under the bus, so to speak, took
Yeah.
money there and betrayed him. 2 different outcomes, both ways.
Yeah.
One had faith in the Lord and the other didn't.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
did not. He did not
Yeah.
repent.
Yeah.
So with all this, it kind of sounds like sometimes God is enabling the devil, enabling
He
people
doesn't
to
enable him, he allows him.
Yeah.
believe that he's not sovereign. He's throwing these other things out there that will help, instead of, like you said, instead of sending the disciples out, he could have just
Yeah.
sent the angels down and said,
Well,
this is the way it is.
When you think about it,
God.
every event in our life is a matter of choices. And that Satan knows that. And that he says, you use this method to do that. You can turn this stone into bread.
I was thinking the same thing.
You can jump off this cliff. You can do these things. So I think it's all part of God's plans to give us an opportunity to choose. And I don't know if I want to use the word hope, but those choices are helping us make the right decision, help us grow.
And not always easy to do, but we have to remember that God works all things together for good if we're trusting in Him. It may not be what we want or expect, but it's what's best for us.
I read that somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's hard to accept.
It is. It's not always easy.
Well, I had a 4th question, but I think that one was the big one, so let's just leave it at that. Any final thoughts?
Especially if you're guys like us, we take care of our own business.